we're going to talk about, or this week we're going to talk about how to write the discussion section and the results. Now, the results section I have written for you already. So if you go to the assignments tab on the left here, you will see down here results. And so I've given you the results section. I've actually analyzed the data for you because it can be fairly difficult if you don't know what you're doing. And so I did this for you. All you have to do is copy and paste this section into your final paper. So you should put this after your method section and before your discussion section. You'll have your results, and all you have to do is copy and paste it, and this is what it looks like. And we're going to go through this in a second. So I've already written the results for you. All you have to do is copy and paste it. I'm going to walk you through what it means and what the limitations are, and the problems we encountered in the study, the online survey study, and there were many problems with that, as to be expected. So let's go back to the assignments tab again. So if you go to assignments, you'll see discussion walkthrough right down here, and then you'll have a place where you can load the discussion section as well. That'll be on here as well. So go to discussion section, and I want 4 paragraphs for the discussion. So paragraph 1, I want you to restate your hypotheses. There were 5 hypotheses. Remember, back in the introduction, I gave you 5 hypotheses to test, and we can show you that, or I can show you that here. If you look at the introduction at the bottom, the last paragraph here, paragraph 8, these are your 5 hypotheses that we tested, or you were supposed to test. And I'm testing them all, and I'm putting all the results in the results section. So in paragraph 1 of the discussion, well, first off, let's start with the word discussion. You're going to write the word discussion. You're going to center it, not bold, not underlined, not italics, just the word discussion. And then below that, you're going to start paragraph 1. State whether you supported your hypotheses or failed to support your hypotheses. So there are 5 hypotheses in just basic words, without using statistics. Tell your audience what the results mean. Without using statistics, so no t-value, no r correlation, no p-values. Just basically, what did we find with the 5 hypotheses? So let's go look at what we found. These are the 5 hypotheses again we're testing, and here are our results. I already had that open. So the results. So the first hypothesis, there was a correlation. It was hypothesized to be a positive correlation between wearing masks and empathy. In the study done, the online survey, there was not a significant correlation. Now, there was a moderate correlation here of 0.485. This is a correlation, Pearson product moment correlation. The problem was there were only 12 subjects. So this significance level, p equals 0.110, this is not considered statistically significant. So there is a correlation there in the right direction that we want, and it looks like if you wear a mask, you tend to have more empathy, or if you have more empathy, you tend to wear more masks. Talking about COVID here. But this did not go to significance because of the low sample size. We only had 12 people complete the survey, which was really, really low. And there were about 30 people in my 2 sections of Site 265. Only 12 of them actually did what I asked them to do. I don't know what happened to the other 18. They either dropped, they didn't do the work, whatever. But I only had 12 people do the survey. So this correlation was in the right direction, which is important, but it's not statistically significant, but it would be if we had a big enough sample. So go out and look for research involving mask wearing and empathy, right? Because you're going to need that in paragraph 2. And our results here in the current study support that. So you're going to write something along the lines of, there was a moderate positive correlation between mask wearing and empathy. R equals 0.45. You don't have to write that in the actual passage. That's the statistics. Just say that there's a positive correlation, but the correlation was not statistically significant due to low sample size. That's it. So there was a moderate correlation, but it was not statistically significant due to the low sample size. So I don't know if that really counts as supporting or not supporting. It's in the right direction. It probably would be statistically significant with a larger sample, but in this particular situation, it wasn't. So the first hypothesis was kind of partially supported. Now let's look at hypothesis 2. Where are the hypotheses again? They're right here. People receiving the COVID-19 vaccine will be more empathic than those not receiving the vaccine. Now we had a big problem with this testing this hypothesis, and the problem was that everybody in the sample received the vaccine. And that kind of makes sense because BMCC is requiring the vaccine even though you're doing the course remotely. If you're taking other classes on campus, you need to have the vaccine, so it makes sense that everybody pretty much had the vaccine. That makes it very difficult to test the hypothesis about empathy and vaccination because there was nobody in the sample that was not vaccinated. In previous semesters, there were people not vaccinated, and it was easier to test that hypothesis, not this semester. So you can just write that this hypothesis of a positive correlation between COVID-19 vaccination and empathy was not able to be tested because every member of the sample was vaccinated. That's all you have to say. There's no point putting in statistics down because there's no comparison group. 12 people vaccinated, 0 people not vaccinated. So that hypothesis didn't work out at all. Hypothesis 3, health anxiety would be positively correlated with fear of future pandemics. Let's look at that. So there was no correlation between health anxiety and fear of future pandemics. I should put correlation here, not hypothesis, because there was a hypothesis, but there was no correlation between health anxiety and fear of future pandemics. Significance level is 0.583. The correlation here was 0.177, which is really weak. I would be expecting a little stronger correlation there, that people that were high in health anxiety would be afraid of this happening again, but what probably happened are people are burned out. They're tired of talking about COVID, and I'm sure you're tired of talking about COVID, and we don't see that here. So there was no significant correlation between health anxiety and fear of future pandemics, and we hypothesized there would be, there wasn't. So that hypothesis failed. The fourth hypothesis, people who have lost friends and family to COVID will have higher levels of depression and generalized anxiety. Let's take a look at that. When we tested that, there was no relationship there. So participants that lost family and friends did not have higher levels of generalized anxiety, and they also didn't have higher levels of depression. So both those hypotheses were not supported as well. So we're not doing too well so far. We've tested 4 of our hypotheses, and 1 was partially supported, the first one, and the other 3 were not supported at all. The last hypothesis is attachment anxiety will be positively correlated with the desire for family and friends to be vaccinated. Let's take a look at that. There was a moderate correlation, but it did not reach significance. So the correlation between attachment anxiety and the desire for family and friends to be vaccinated was pretty decent, 0.403, but once again, it didn't reach significance because of the low sample size. So this one was also partially supported. So the total rundown was the first hypothesis was partially supported, hypothesis 2, 3, and 4 were not supported at all, and hypothesis 5 was partially supported. Those partially supported hypotheses was due to low sample size, only 12 participants in the study. And I've written the results for you. All you have to do is copy and paste it from Blackboard. It's under the assignments page. You just copy and paste it into your final paper, and that's it. You don't have to change anything. Just copy and paste. So all of that information about the 5 hypotheses go into paragraph 1 of the discussion. Let's go back here, discussion. Paragraph 1 is just restating, whether you supported or failed to support each hypothesis. What I just basically went through, the 5 hypotheses. You can put that into your first paragraph. Do not include data, do not include statistics, do not include any numbers. Just basically, was the hypothesis supported or not? And I guess you can mention that the 2 that were partially supported were due to low sample size, and that if the sample size was increased, they would be fully supported, because that's what would happen. But that's paragraph 1, so very easy. Just summarize the results of the study without statistics. Paragraph 2, how did your findings relate to past research? So the stuff that you talked about in the introduction, does the class study result, does that support the stuff you talked about in the introduction or fail to support it? So was it different than the previous research? And there's a lot of stuff here to look at. The correlation between mask wearing and empathy. We partially supported that. Was that supported in the previous research? Did they find a positive correlation in previous research? In previous research, did they see anything about vaccination and empathy? Talk about the studies. Which studies were a problem? Which studies sort of supported this idea and which studies didn't? So you've done the previous research on the hypotheses here, and you want to talk about which ones are supporting what we found in the study and which ones are not. And we'll talk a little bit more about why in the third paragraph. So just basically give me a rundown of studies that either supported or failed to support it. So you should have at least 1 for each of the 5 hypotheses in paragraph 2. So the results of this current study did not support the results of the previous research by so-and-so. You want to cite those previous studies and talk about whether or not the current results either supported or failed to support the previous studies. You should have 1 study for each hypothesis. Each hypothesis that we're testing. That's paragraph 2. So that requires a little more work because you're going to have 5 studies. You should be citing 5 studies in paragraph 2, ideally. So the first hypothesis between empathy, positive correlation between empathy and mask wearing was different than the previous research by so-and-so author. You should write that in paragraph 2. And then talk about hypothesis 2. The positive correlation between, or the difference between mask wearing and empathy that we're looking at, or vaccinations and empathy, I should say, did not support the previous research, or the previous research supported what we found between between vaccinations and empathy. We didn't really find anything, so just talk about the previous research. Obviously, we couldn't test that hypothesis, the second hypothesis, because we didn't have enough participants that did not get vaccinated. All of our participants got vaccinated, so that one's easy. You just talk about the previous research. Previous research found that there was a difference between vaccination and empathy. People high in empathy got vaccinated more than people low in empathy, if that's what the previous research talks about, which I believe it does. And then hypothesis 3. We found that there was no correlation between health anxiety and fear of future pandemics. What did previous research show? Did previous research show any kind of correlation there? You may not find exact questions involving fear of future pandemics, but you'll find something with regard to anxiety. People worried that this can happen again. Are people generally worried about this pandemic happening again? Maybe it'll be worse than what happened this time. I'm talking about people other than Bill Gates. Bill Gates has been worried about pandemics forever, and he's on TV all the time talking about it, and you can't really go by Bill Gates. But other people in general, are they talking about, what will happen in the future? Are people worried about this? If so, cite it. Talk about the research. Cite that study. So that's hypothesis 3. Hypothesis 4, family and friends. Did they have higher levels of depression? So go look for previous research. Our study showed nothing. Previous research probably showed something. So there's a difference. Talk about it. So that second paragraph should be going through those 5 hypotheses and saying so-and-so study agreed or disagreed with each of the hypotheses that we tested, with our findings. Did other people agree with our findings? Chances are they didn't. Because the class study we did was very flawed. Very, very flawed. We had a very low sample size. We had everybody vaccinated. There were a lot of problems with our study. And that sort of leads me into paragraph 3. Let's go to paragraph 3. If you failed to support your hypotheses, which happened a lot, please explain why. What were the limitations? Well, the biggest problems here that you want to talk about are low sample size. 12 people is not enough. Ideally, I didn't want 12 people. I wanted 30. I got 12. So now we're doing a class study with 12. This has been the worst turnout in terms of, or worst completion percentage of the surveys of any of the semesters I've been doing this, and I've been doing this since the pandemic, because the pandemic was the big thing. Maybe it's not the big thing anymore, no one cares. Maybe that's why no one took the survey, even though they were supposed to. But 12 people is not a lot to take the survey. There may be COVID burnout, but from my perspective, it's very important to understand why people did what they did. So why did some people wear masks? Why did some people get vaccinated? Why did some others not? Not only because you had people dying left and right, and plenty of people I knew personally dying left and right, but also because you have this persistent feeling that still exists today. The government is controlling you. The government's telling you to get vaccinated, so you shouldn't do it. There are people that believe this. And if the severity of the virus, of COVID, was worse than what it was, we could have had millions and millions of people dying because of these attitudes. You know, I mean, the fatality rate of COVID was around 1%. Imagine if it was smallpox and it affected 20% of the population and half those people would die from it. That means a 10% fatality or mortality rate. And you have a bunch of people saying, I don't believe this. I don't believe the government's telling me to do this. I don't want to do this. I don't want to get vaccinated. I don't want to wear masks. I don't want to social distance from myself. I want to live my life. So imagine a scenario like that with a 10% mortality rate. How many people would die? And so this pandemic, we may be all burned out on it. We may not care anymore. We may think it was overhyped. It was ridiculous. They tried to stop us from living. Well, in this particular situation with a 1% mortality rate, we got lucky. I mean, that's the bottom line. We got lucky. Not to get COVID, but we got lucky because COVID did not kill a lot of people. I mean, it killed plenty of people, but it didn't kill a significant portion of the population. When you're talking about less than, 1 million deaths out of a country of 360 plus million people, the mortality rate is relatively low. But the next pandemic could kill 20 or 50 times or 100 times as many people. And there will be another pandemic. It's just a matter of when, not if. And are we going to be prepared for it? Or are we going to go back into our own political places or deal with our political bases who are telling us either to wear a mask or not wear a mask? And it becomes a political issue. That, certain types of people, if you have a certain politics or political belief, you think the government's lying to you, you're not going to cooperate. You don't believe that shutting down the economy was the way to go. And then you have other people that were very concerned. And I'm not saying that the government, handled it right. They didn't. I mean, the whole thing was blown out of proportion. The CDC was just all over the place. They were a disaster. So I can understand why a certain group of people do not trust the government. The problem is that in the future, if mortality goes up with a pandemic, and those same people still don't trust the government, we're talking about millions and millions of people dying. So how do we fix this problem? How do we get people to take things seriously? And yes, it's more complicated than just wearing masks and getting vaccinated, although those are two very important concepts. But how do we get people to comply more effectively? Do we change the messaging? That's all the stuff that this study seeks to sort of ascertain. How big of a problem is it? And there are many limitations of the study, and the biggest one is sample size, so you want to include that. And then the other limitations are everybody was vaccinated. Another limitation is that, our sample is primarily from New York City residents. Our sample is overwhelmingly female. Maybe if we had a better, more balanced sample, we would see something different, but we don't. Those are all limitations of our study. Low sample, all vaccinated. There were no unvaccinated people. Predominantly female, predominantly younger in age. Right? We're not talking about older people. We're talking about mainly people in their 20s. No men in the sample. Men think differently than women with regard to COVID. So those are all limitations that you need to go into in paragraph 3. Are there any problems with internal external validity? Internal validity is cause and effect. External validity is the ability to generalize from the sample to the population. While internal validity, there is none because it's a survey. So there's no cause and effect conclusions with a survey. So internal validity is low or non-existent. External validity is the ability to generalize from a sample to a population. That's limited here because our sample is predominantly young, female, and New York residents. I would not want to generalize our sample to the entire U.S. population. People in the middle of the country think a lot differently than New Yorkers do. New York had a very high rate of compliance. They also had a very high rate of deaths, and that was due to the New York being the epicenter of the COVID pandemic at the beginning, when there were no treatments. But there were a lot of deaths, but there was also a lot of compliance. People listened. New Yorkers, took things seriously for the most part. Whereas, places in the middle of the country, more in the South, they had very low compliance, very low vaccination rates. So the external validity is kind of questionable here if we're talking about the general population. Our samples predominantly New Yorkers. So there's a lot to write in paragraph 3 here. Paragraph 4, what are the real world implications of the results? Well, the results kind of tell us that, having empathy is a good thing. It helps us get vaccinated. It helps us keep, wear masks, social distance ourselves. If you care about other people, if you can take another person's perspective, I should say, more than just caring about other people, that's empathy, taking another person's perspective. If you can do that, then you're more willing to take precautions. If you can't take another person's perspective and you're just entirely egocentric, all you care about is yourself, all you think about is yourself, then you may not care. You may just say, screw it, I'm going to enjoy my life. I'm going to go out and I'm going to party. I'm going to be one of those people that goes to the bar without a mask, without anything, and I'm going to have fun, and whatever happens, happens. I'm not afraid of it. And you saw that a lot with the younger population, where it's like, oh, I'm stuck in the house, I'm stuck in my apartment, I can't go out see my friends, I can't have fun, my life is being ruined, I can't stand for this, I need to go out and live my life. And you understand the sort of need to do that. But at the same time, if you can put yourself in another person's perspective, what if I get somebody sick? Or what if that person gets sick and brings it home to their family and someone gets sick and possibly dies from it? So these are real world implications, about, people's behavior. If there's a positive correlation between empathy and vaccinations or empathy and mask wearing, then we can train people to become more empathic. And if we do that, we'll increase compliance. Is it that simple? Is it just about empathy? Or even attachment? If we can get people to activate their attachment styles, especially if they're anxiously attached and they can take more precautions, maybe that's a good thing. Maybe that saves lives. So talk about this. Why is this kind of research important? And I think it is because we need to identify factors that will lead to a better understanding of how to deal with pandemics and a more successful basically paradigm or process for dealing with it in the future. And then you also want to talk about the limitations of your study. How do you fix them? So low sample size, very easy to fix. Go out and get more people. But, what kind of sample do we want and what do we have to do to fix things? How do we get a better sample? Should we be taking samples out of, research methods classes? Probably not, right? How do we do a better sample? Do we want to get a mix of gender? Do we want to get a mix of ethnicity? Do we want to get a mix of ages in our sample? Because the current sample we're using for this study was small, young, female, and vaccinated. So we have a very homogeneous group, and that doesn't really tell us much. So there's lots of ways to improve this study moving forward, starting with the sample, improving the sample. And so this is 4 paragraphs. It should take you, a couple pages to write. 2 pages, 1.5 pages, something like that. For 4 decent sized paragraphs should be definitely 1.5 pages to 2 pages. If you're handing me like half a page, it's not enough. You want to really flush out, expand out on each of these 4 paragraphs. So 4 decently sized paragraphs, double spaced, 12 point font, 1-inch margins. Make sure discussion is centered at the top. And then you'll submit them. There'll be a link on Blackboard under the assignments page. You'll submit it as a PDF file. And that's it. Then I'll give you feedback. And I'm sure there'll be plenty of feedback, and you'll be able to make the changes from my comments for the final paper. So hopefully this helped, go through the results. We had some pretty bad results. But once again, it's because our sample was so small. And things we can fix in the future. And if we're going to continue with this research, or I should say if I'm going to continue with this research moving forward, maybe I vary it a bit more in the future. So hopefully that helps. If you have questions, let me know. If not, I look forward to reading your discussion sections shortly and giving you feedback on your discussion sections as soon as possible. So bye for now, and I'll see you next time for the title, abstract, and references.